Good afternoon. Assalamu alaikum. My name is Edina Lekovic, and I'm the Communications Director for the Muslim Public Affairs Council. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you for being prompt about returning for lunch. We know this is the hardest time of day to be prompt. We have the honor this afternoon of dealing with a very difficult subject, but at the same time bringing together a very diverse set of individuals and experts so that we can talk about the various angles of this issue. As we all know, the horrific attacks that took place in Mumbai nearly a month ago received the amount of international attention that tracked the progress of those attacks over the course of a few days, and that were broadcast into homes throughout the world, and that re-brought up questions that are critical to all faith communities, but that once again have a particular relevance to our community. So we at MPAC decided to add this panel, and I thank our panelists for being flexible with us as we shifted the topic over, so that we could talk about this issue, and so that we can span the course of talking about not only the aftermath of the attacks and the national and international discourse of those attacks, but also what those attacks mean here in the United States, what we know, what we don't know, and what we should and shouldn't do from this point forward. As you know, MPAC's approach on issues like this is to think about how international issues have a very domestic and a very local impact. And so we're honored to have with us a unique panel of individuals who come from very different backgrounds and who hopefully will be able to have what I know will be a very interesting and engaging conversation about the array of issues that have been brought up. So let me introduce to you our panelists. We have on the far end, let's start down there, we have the chairman of the MPAC Board of Directors, Dr. Nair Ali, who is a practicing physician, also an expert in South Asian issues and policy, who's the co-author of In Pursuit of Justice, the Jurisprudence of Human Rights in Islam, and who's also a columnist with the Pakistan Link newspaper, among many, many others. I'm going to shorten things here. You have most of these bios in your program. Next to him, we have Reza Aslan, who is an internationally acclaimed writer. He's the author of the New York Times best-selling book, No God But God, The Origin, Evolution, and Future of Islam. It's been translated into more than 13 languages. And he's the author of the forthcoming book, How to Win a Cosmic War, particularly relevant in our discussions here. He is also a fellow at USC's Center on Public Diplomacy, and many of you may have seen him on various television programs, my favorite, of course, being The Daily Show. He makes a great regular guest there. And he is also the founder of a great new program called BoomGen Studios, and hopefully we'll find a way to bring that into the conversation here. Next to Reza, we have Kiran Khalid, who is a broadcast journalist. She's a producer with ABC News, working on the Good Morning America program. She is, in many ways, a trailblazer in the Muslim community in terms of working directly in the news industry. Her experiences in journalism are over many continents. She has done documentary work in South Asia around the issue of madrasas, and also looking at the issue of censorship, of media censorship there. She is also on the board of the South Asian Journalists Association, and we're thrilled that she found a way to get here, given that she was coming from New York and all those flights, 500 plus, got canceled. So you're made of tough skin to have finally made it here. And then finally, we have Varun Soni, who is the Dean of Religious Life at USC. He has the unique distinction of being the first Hindu Dean of Religious Life at any university in the United States. He also has a very unique and diverse background from having a law degree from UCLA and serving as an articles editor on UCLA's Journal of Islamic and Near Eastern law, to spending a semester living as a Buddhist monk in the Burmese monastery in India, to getting his PhD now from a university in South Africa. He is really leading the cause in bringing people of different faiths together, particularly on university campuses. And so please join me in welcoming our panel. Now, as we all know, the attacks in Mumbai took place over the course of 3 days during our Thanksgiving weekend here in the United States. They were perpetrated by 10 young men who unleashed these violent attacks on 9 locations throughout Mumbai, including a railway station, popular restaurants, the hotels in which hundreds of hostages were taken, and over the course of that time, more than 200 people were killed. We are going to start off this session with a short video that Kiran has been kind enough to provide to us, which is part of the coverage that ABC News provided. It's a brief glimpse that I want to use to set the stage, and then we'll be beginning our conversation from there.
President Bush has dispatched Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice to the region as the world watches to see how the Indian government will respond. Our Dan Harris, live in Mumbai with the very latest for us this morning. Good morning, Dan.
Robin, good morning. Today, they finally finished searching the huge and historic Taj Mahal Hotel behind me for both bodies and booby traps. Also today, the Indians are saying they have even more evidence that this plot had its roots in Pakistan. So now the world is watching very anxiously to see how India is going to respond. Today we're seeing new grainy amateur video from inside the Taj Hotel during the siege. And we're learning new details about the plot from this young man, the only terrorist captured alive, seen here in the throes of the violence, wearing a black t-shirt with a Versace logo. He is Ajmal Amir Kasab, reportedly a 21-year-old Pakistani with a 4th grade education, who is reportedly telling Indian interrogators he is a member of a Pakistani Islamic extremist group. According to published reports today, Kasab has said he and his compatriots received a year of commando training in Pakistan, in weapons, explosives, and survival, and then came here to Mumbai on a reconnaissance mission, scoping out their targets.
Do we really think it was only 10 gunmen involved in this?
That does amazingly seem to be the case. This has been a standard pattern, 2 to 3 people entering a building, throwing grenades, opening fire in the unprotected lobby area, and then entering the building and holding out essentially till the TV cameras get there.
However, there are also reports today that the 10 terrorists may have had local accomplices for whom police are searching right now. Many Indians are very angry at the government for failing to stop the attacks. Today, more senior officials are resigning. There is also enormous anger here at Pakistan. Many believe the country's intelligence agency, the ISI, may have played a role in the attacks.
Pakistan's civilian leadership is simply caving in to the agenda which is set by the ISI and the army.
The Pakistani government has said it had nothing to do with the attacks, and today their president is quoted as saying he's worried the terrorists could provoke a war between these 2 nuclear neighbors. Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice's visit to India on Wednesday is designed to reduce tensions between the 2 countries, which are a nightmare for Washington because it makes it increasingly likely that Pakistan will take its eye off the fight against al-Qaeda and the Taliban. Just hours ago, Secretary Rice said Pakistan needs to give its absolute and total cooperation to this investigation. Robin?
First in this half hour, more of the incredible stories of Americans caught inside the Mumbai's terror siege. Michael Pollock and his wife Anjali were having drinks in the Taj Mahal Hotel when they heard an explosion of noise out in the lobby. When you went back for cover, you all made the brave decision to split up because you have 2 small children. Michael, you are American, and there were some early reports that Americans were being targeted. How difficult was it for you all to make that decision, Anjali, to separate?
I did it for my kids. That's all I can say. You know, I think we just did what we had to do. And in that room there, I was so sure that I wasn't coming back, and I just hoped he was going to go home for the kids, because I didn't think we were both going to get out of there.
Here, and Anjali, you also had something that you wanted
Yes,
to make
I wanted to make sure to say that terrorists are terrorists. They don't have a soul and they don't have a religion. I grew up in India and I consider myself Indian and equally American. I have Muslim friends who I consider to be part of my family. They are not like this. This is not Muslims. These people are soulless terrorists. They do not have the right to call themselves Muslims. There was a group next to me of Bori Muslims who prayed right beside me the whole night. They would have been slaughtered just like me. So this should not be misinterpreted as a Muslim group. These are just terrorists.
Thank you for your strength and being here and making it back. Damien and Zachary, your two little ones. But thank you for your strength and your bravery and for your story.
Thank you
Michael,
to
Anjali.
everybody.
Thank you very much.
All right. So with that backdrop in mind, Kiran, I want to start with you. Let's start by talking about the media coverage of the attacks. I think that this was the first time in a case like this where we saw 24-hour news coverage that was documenting what was taking taking place hour by hour. Why was the coverage so intense, do you think? And what is your assessment as somebody who is both a member of the media and a member of the Muslim community in terms of the quality of that coverage?
Well, I want to begin by just saying that I work for ABC News, but the opinions and thoughts that I express here today are my own and don't represent the network in any way. In terms of the amount of coverage and how it was wall-to-wall coverage that way, there are several factors that go into why we cover anything round the clock or at all. It has to do with competing news stories. In this case, much of the media, while the rest of the American public was, suffering from election fatigue, we were going through election withdrawal. We wanted our next big story. And so this happened to come at that time. In addition to that, it was the first time that ABC and CNN were really able to leverage their partnerships that had just been made with Indian media. ABC, just within the last year, has created a conduit between what we do in New York and what happens in India, so that all of their live coverage was being fed to us directly. And so we were able to transmit those images of breaking news. And the fact that we found out that Americans and Brits were being targeted gave us a new angle in terms of, or a valid angle rather, in terms of it being relevant to an American audience. So I think all of those factors just basically created a perfect opportunity for us to engage the viewers at a time when there weren't many other stories happening, and not to diminish the value of the story. I mean, obviously, it was very traumatic for a lot of people. A lot of tourists visit India, and many of them have dined or stayed at the Taj or the Oberoi hotels and are very familiar with it. But I think that it really was just the right story at the right time, and we had the resources to give it that kind of coverage.
Okay. Reactions from other panelists in terms of what you saw from media coverage. Was it fair? Was it accurate? Was it three-dimensional? Was it different than that of previous or other attacks?
Seemed pretty standard to me, so yeah. Okay.
I would say that I thought it was a little, Bombay has suffered, tremendously. Since 1992, there have been a series of attacks. There was the Bombay Stock Exchange attack in '93 where hundreds of people were killed. There were the train blasts in 2006 where 300 people were killed. There was the pogrom against Muslims in Gujarat where over nearly 1,000 people were killed. I think compared to those events, this got more press, and I would echo Kiran's sentiments that there was something about the fact that I think Westerners were victimized and people who are members of elite society were also victimized that perhaps drew out a more prolonged coverage. I'm not saying that this shouldn't have got prolonged coverage, but I felt like the other events really didn't get the coverage that they deserved in terms of a mainstream worldwide media. And even within this attack, the attacks at the train station, the old Victoria Terminus station, didn't receive as much coverage as, say, the attacks at the Taj. Once again, there's a different class of people, there's a different demographic of people that are being impacted. So I think there may be something going on, there may be some aspect that impacts the way the coverage happens because it is a westernized and elite demographic that's being impacted. And what I also thought was interesting is that recently in India there's been a proliferation of media outlets, both print media and cable news channels. And for the first time, I think they really were able to own a story and run with it through its duration. And I noticed that CNN was feeding NTV Live to CNN so that people around the world were actually listening to Indian reporters tell an Indian story. And that's something completely unique within the media landscape of South Asia. And I think that that's an interesting story as well that really hasn't been told, how the Indian press reacted and what that tells us about this new Indian media.
Well, on that note, let's just keep in mind that, of course, the terrorism by definition is a theatrical public display of violence. The reason that these 10 men were so successful, and the reason, by the way, that they targeted Westerners was not for any ideological reason. We can talk about, the goals and ideologies of Lashkar-e-Taiba, that's the group that's been widely recognized as behind these attacks a little bit later on, but we should emphasize that this is a deeply nationalist organization. They have no transnational goals whatsoever. The sole purpose for attacking Westerners is to get the Western media involved. Terrorism, you must understand that terrorism is very, very rarely used as a strategy to bring about any kind of specific social or political change. Terrorism doesn't change events on the ground. Terrorism is a symbolic act. It's meant to be an act that provides a sense of an illusion of power. And power is granted through attention, through media attention. And one of the reasons why I think these groups did what they did insofar as, I mean, they went into this as a suicide mission, of course. Just because they weren't suicide bombers doesn't mean that they weren't suicide terrorists. But they were quite smart in recognizing that simply blowing yourself up gets you in a 24-hour news cycle. Taking hostages makes that news cycle last perhaps 48 hours. Taking Americans makes that news cycle last for months. And this is the very purpose of terrorism. And in that regard, they were, I think, hugely successful.
You know, I think one of the other things to keep in mind is that if these attacks had happened 10 or 15 years ago, the global interest in this and the American interest in this would have been much less. I think what you seeing in India, of course, is this economic boom, this integration of India with the global economic system. And these targets were targets that are areas of intersection between Indian business and global business. This is where businessmen go and travel to. This is the intersection of modern India and the outside world. This was not an attack in Old Delhi. So I think that the targets that were chosen here were symbolically much more relevant to an outside global audience. And that partly explains why they were got so much more attention than, for example, the train bombings did.
Well, if I could just add that I would love to think that I worked in an industry that gave that much thought to the issues that we covered and really analyzed the implications to a larger audience and the fact that it was, the center of the film industry and the center of the economy, and so much American investment is in India. But the fact of the matter is that 9 times out of 10, we cover stories because we have access and they're compelling. Simply being compelling doesn't always drive our coverage because along with other industries, our resources are shrinking and we're contending with budgets. We're dealing with a proliferation of media in other countries that can provide us with coverage. We're shutting down our foreign bureaus as a result of that. And this was just a situation where you had really exciting footage unfolding, and however peripheral or central it was to the conflict, there were Americans involved, and that's what really drove our coverage.
Okay, so piggybacking off the point that that you made, Nair, in terms of Mumbai having this unique place, in terms of it being a commercial place and all of those things, much has been written about the scale of these attacks, and a comparison has been made quite frequently by commentators to the US's 9/11. In terms of where they targeted, who was killed, that kind of thing. And we've heard over and over again that this is India's 9/11. Is it India's 9/11? Do you think that that's fair or unfair, true or false? I read something recently from Arundhati Roy, of course, the Pulitzer Prize-winning author of God of Small Things, and I thought very interesting that she wrote, as the carnage in Mumbai raged on day after horrible day, our 24-hour news channels informed us that we're watching India's 9/11. Like actors in a Bollywood ripoff of an old Hollywood family, we're expected to play our parts and say our lines, even though we know it's all been said and done before, as only Arundhati Roy can put it. But so I put it to you, is this India's 9/11?
I think this was, I'm sorry, I think this was an opportunity for the Indian media to really make a name for itself. And as is with any media that's just beginning, I mean, they are, by many standards, in their infancy. They're very sensational, and they did sensationalize this story to the extent that they could. And for them to say, and their captions throughout their coverage said India's 9/11, which added to the urgency and intensity of the moment. But no, and I think, as a New Yorker and people who covered the actual 9/11, lived through it and witnessed it, it was a fraction of what happened here. And, it's a disservice to our viewership when we have to transmit the images with those same sensational captions because we're running a live feed. I mean, ideally, we would have liked to have, maybe contextualize it in a different way, but it seeped into our consciousness as an American public because we were feeding those images and those captions from India.
I think how Indians perceive the attack is ultimately up to the Indians. I can't say how they would see it. I think certainly in terms of the scale of the attack, it was the body count was a fraction of 9/11, obviously. And the shock value of it was quite different because the United States had not experienced a significant terrorist attack on its soil in decades, perhaps, while India has been experiencing problems with terrorism and separatist violence since its inception, essentially. So, and frankly, I think, for example, the attack on the Indian Parliament building 6 years ago had a much more of a spectacular nature to it than this did in many ways. It was an attack directly on the heart of Indian government. And then the scale of violence that's gone on in Kashmir in the last 10 years is substantially much larger than what went on in Mumbai. So I don't think you can compare it in any direct way in that sense. Whether India chooses to use this politically as a 9/11 type event is something that the Indian government and the Indian people will choose for themselves. I can't say whether they will or will not. I think that there are some constraints in that the response of the United States to 9/11 was to declare a war on terror. India does not really have that option in the sense of a conventional war against the sources of this, and from the Indian perspective, this is sourced in Pakistan, because Pakistan has nuclear weapons and there is a deterrence there that prevented a war 6 years ago and will prevent a war going forward. I think the Indians were quite aware of that, and this time they did not respond the way they did in 2002 with the mobilization of the army. In fact, the Indian response has been quite restrained. There's been some rhetoric, but there's been no mobilization. So I think based on how the Indian government has responded in the first 4 weeks, their answer is no, this is not 9/11 for them.
I think it's dangerous to think of it in terms of 9/11. I've also read Arundhati's Roy's article, and it's available online. I encourage all of you to read it. It's called 9 is not 11 and November is not September. And her point is India is not the US and Pakistan is not Afghanistan. There are historical and cultural and political differences that need to be taken into consideration. And when we just start saying 9/11, does that then mean we have to react in the same way that we reacted in 9/11? In 2001, when the Indian Parliament was attacked, the response was similar to what the American response was post 9/11. There was the introduction of the Prevention of Terrorism Act, POTA, which was in fact modeled a little bit or substantively after the Patriot Act, and India amassed 500,000 troops on the Pakistani border, and we were all thinking that this could be a build-up to war. So I think that it's, and even when 9/11 happened in the US, you know, the press talked about it as this is the 21st century's Pearl Harbor. So I think there's a natural tendency to compare it to something you know. But the danger in that is that, well, if this is India's 9/11, then does India then have to behave the way the US behaved after 9/11 in terms of war, in terms of civil liberties, et cetera? So I think that's the danger of that type of comparison.
So in terms of how the attacks and the implications of these attacks, what effect, if any, do you think that they have domestically? How do they impact Hindu-Muslim relations here in the United States? What kinds of things have you all seen or experienced on that side of things? And Varun, perhaps you can talk about things at USC specifically here.
Yeah, so you know, at USC we have more students from India, international students from India, than any school in the country. We have over 1,500 students from India. One of our trustees is Ratan Tata, who's the chairman of the Taj, which owns, or chairman of the Tata Group, which owns the Taj Group, which runs the Taj. And even my own in-laws, my wife's parents were checked into the Oberoi the night of the attacks, and unbeknownst to us, they had checked out that morning and had moved to Juhu, the Marriott. We didn't know that. So a lot of us on our campus were frantic during this week, calling home, getting information, a lot of misinformation about what was happening. But when we came back after Thanksgiving break, we held a multi-faith memorial service and candlelight vigil. And for the first time in USC's history, we had the Association of Indian Students and the Pakistani Student Association co-sponsor an event together. And during the event, we had readings from the Quran, the Gita, the Christian Bible, the Hebrew Bible, and we had a candlelight vigil afterwards. We had Muslim and Hindu students praying and mourning together. We had Indian and Pakistani students lighting candles together. And I thought that was a particularly powerful moment, not just on our campus, but around the country where these vigils and memorial services were happening. Because for our Pakistani students from Pakistan and our Indian students from India, there isn't really an opportunity to engage in that way in their home countries. But when they come abroad, when they come to the United States, they have the opportunity to reflect upon an event like this together, to talk to one another about how it impacts them. And my hope is that these are elite members of society. Anyone who can come pay full tuition at USC is going to go back into their back to their home country in a position of power. And hopefully they'll engender a particular type of multi-faith, interfaith consciousness that they will then be able to take back to them, back with them. And I think that's one of the unique aspects about what we can do in the U.S. This was specifically around international students who are studying in the U.S. But around domestic Hindu-Muslim engagement issues, I think what's interesting in the United States is many of us who are from India or Pakistan or from South Asia who grew up in the United States have developed a South Asian identity as opposed to an Indian identity or a Pakistani identity. So when I talk about South Asia, I refer to India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal, Bhutan, and the islands of the Indian Ocean, and some people consider Afghanistan part of South Asia as well. So when we develop this collective South Asian identity abroad, and we develop organizations like, I was part of a group called South Asians for Obama. We have the South Asian Network here. I think we can leave behind some of our regional, religious, caste-based, language-based prejudices and create a different type of South Asian identity, which you don't really even have in South Asia. And I think that type of identity allows us to engage with one another in a way that's uniquely, perhaps, diasporic.
I want to just take a quick break here and remind you that it is your turn very soon to add to the conversation. So any questions that you have, there should be ushers coming around with cards. I'm blinded by the light, so I can't see them, but hopefully you can. So please write down your questions, and we'll incorporate those. Okay, so shifting courses a little bit, unless somebody would like to add something about domestic issues or domestic, okay. In terms of the U.S.'s role in South Asia. So from part of the media coverage that we saw, and as we all know, Secretary of State Rice was quickly brought to the region to sit down with the leaders. There's obviously a great deal of tension and a lot of finger pointing that is taking place. And so I am curious about opinions about the transition to the Obama administration, the role of Hillary Clinton as the next Secretary of State, and what you imagine should be the future direction of U.S. policy in the region, priorities.
Well, I think everybody knows Hillary Clinton is enormously popular in South Asia, hugely popular, and I think it's a good thing that she as Secretary of State is going to bring a different kind of perspective on the region. Right now, basically American foreign policy in South Asia has been geared towards economic or national security interests. That explains why we have violated international laws with regard to our nuclear deal with India. It explains why we have pumped almost $10 billion into Pakistan, into the Pakistani military in order to get its aid in fighting the various insurgent elements in the Northwest Tribal Frontier. But we've yet to actually conceive of a foreign policy that treats that region, India, Pakistan, and Kashmir, as a single entity. And I think that what you're going to see that's different about this coming State Department, as opposed to the previous State Department, is a real regional focus. There's a lot of discussion now about the possibility of naming a special envoy, perhaps Dick Holbrooke, who I think is perfect for the job, Ambassador Richard Holbrooke, who's had an enormous amount of success dealing with these kinds of ethnic and sectarian conflicts. But somebody whose principal focus is to help India and Pakistan not continue to maintain this tense state of peace with one another, but more importantly to really come up with an answer to the Kashmir problem, which is something that's been completely ignored by the U.S. administration. It's understood as a problem, it's recognized as an issue that has to be dealt with, but very little has been done to specifically deal with Kashmir. And there's a very good reason for that, because there's really not very many good answers to what to do. But I think having a special envoy to the region, and also the other thing that's very important about Dick Holbrooke is, besides his many other accomplishments, he's also the president of the Asia Society. And the Asia Society took part in a report about this region that came out a while ago, where it put forth a proposal which it referred to as a grand bargain approach, which would mean that rather than continuing to deal with India and Pakistan and Kashmir as separate and distinct issues, and dealing with them only insofar as they have to do with American interests, bringing in the regional actors, especially Russia, Iran, and China, and trying to create some kind of a regional alliance that would bring a sense of stability and a sense of international cooperation that has really been missing. And I think that Hillary Clinton is precisely the kind of person to bring this about. So we should be quite optimistic. In fact, there is a theory amongst a lot of national security experts here in the United States is that the deliberate timing of this event was precisely to derail the Obama administration's plans to make this region a much larger focus. Because again, let's keep in mind that the Lashkar militants who were very likely behind this attack were not pursuing any kind of political goal. There was nothing that they were engaged in. There was no goal, there was no aspiration involved in this. This was not, let's attack these hotels in order to bring independence to Kashmir. That was the furthest thing from their minds. This was not an act of holy war. I mean, we've referred to them as Muslim militants because they happen to be Muslim, but as we know, these were militants who had a very rudimentary education and a very rudimentary understanding of Islam, who were hopped up on steroids and cocaine and heroin during the siege. But if there was sort of a larger aspirational agenda to this attack, it would very likely have been to derail the hoped for changes that were very likely going to be brought about with an Obama administration.
I hope Reza is right about the Obama administration, and perhaps we'll see some more activist policy in South Asia. I am somewhat more pessimistic. My own view is I think the U.S. policy in South Asia with respect to India is driven by primarily commercial considerations. India is a rising economic superpower and providing a lot of the back office functions for a lot of America's largest corporations. In addition, I think that the United States sees India as a counterweight to China in Asia in long-term strategic sense. So they see an American-Indian alliance as a counterweight to the rising power of China. They see Pakistan, I think the United States sees Pakistan primarily in the context of the war on terror, the fight against the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, and stabilizing Afghanistan. And they want to see Pakistan do more on that front, and what they're interested in is Pakistan continuing to prosecute that very aggressively to the extent that the Pakistanis are willing to do so. I think the other thing that, the other dynamic in South Asia is that India is pretty much a status quo power. They're very happy with settling the Kashmir issue on the line of control, as it is. If Pakistan was willing to accept that as the basis of a permanent settlement, the Indians would certainly be happy with the current situation. The Pakistanis are not. They are the ones that want something to be changed, something different. Some transfer of some portion of Kashmir, the Muslim majority regions, to Pakistan would be what the Pakistanis would want. I don't see how any democratically elected Indian government could actually do that. With that impasse, the choices for Pakistan are fairly bleak. They can either accept the situation or they can continue some sort of low-intensity conflict with India, which is what went on throughout the 1990s. They were attempting to do in Kashmir what they had successfully done with the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. And that strategy eventually came to an end in 2001 when India escalated and possibly threatened war. The Pakistanis had to stop that for the most part, and they have substantially reduced the amount of cross-border attacks. But that forced Lashkar no longer had any various easy options for attacking in Kashmir. I think that is one of the origins for why they attacked in Bombay, because they no longer had the full support of the Pakistani government, which they did have in the past. So I think that there are these issues out there that the U.S. government is not going to be able to change in any meaningful way. If they can somehow come up with a creative solution that will satisfy both the Indians and the Pakistanis on the issue of Kashmir, and the Kashmiris themselves too, who should have a voice in this. And the Kashmiris of India, the Muslim Kashmiris, do not see themselves as Indians. Fundamentally, that is not their own sense of identity. And this is a problem for the Indians to deal with. There is a very powerful nonviolent movement now among the Kashmiri Indians, Kashmiri Muslims, I'm sorry, in opposition to the Indian government, and that's going on too. So this issue is very complicated, and I am skeptical that even somebody as as brilliant as Holbrooke and Hillary Clinton are going to be able to really tackle it. But I hope I'm wrong. I hope Reza is correct on this.
Let me just very quickly add that that the Kashmiris want neither. They don't want India or Pakistan, and I think that's something that has to be understood. We keep, and until the Kashmiri independent, aspirations are actually brought to the table, then it's all a waste of time.
In terms of U.S. foreign policy with this new administration, I admittedly don't have as much knowledge as my colleagues in terms of the Kashmir issue, but one thing that I do know, having worked in the northwest frontier of Pakistan and having covered stories in Pakistan, as long as the United States government continues to unilaterally strike within Pakistan, it's going to contribute to the instability of that region. And that puts them several steps backwards in the war on terror. So from what I've seen, and again, I'm not as knowledgeable about it, I don't see Kashmir even on the US government's radar screen. But this issue is front and center. And they need to, I personally, not speaking as a member of any media organization, I personally feel like it's something where the United States is yet again failing to recognize the sovereignty of a nation. And by continuing to do so, they're only going to exacerbate the problem of terrorism in that region.
And I agree with Reza. I mean, the elephant in the room is Kashmir. The Kashmiris have really been, I think, betrayed by Pakistani and Indian leadership for 50 years. They never got the plebiscite that Nehru had promised them back in 1947. But I do think Obama has Kashmir on his radar more than anyone in the Bush administration might have, and I have seen him talk about it before these attacks as something that he wanted to engage with. And it's true that the Clintons are rock stars in South Asia, and there could be some role for Bill or Hillary to play in Kashmir. I think perhaps another aspect of the timing, which I haven't read so much about, but it could have been that this was also a sign directed towards Zardari, the new president of Pakistan, who in weeks before this had been going around India talking about how he wanted to expand economic relationship with India. And I think this is a way, I think finally the corruption of the Indian and the Pakistani politicians could actually play for peace, because if we follow the money trail and we can somehow economically integrate the economies of India and Pakistan, perhaps in a free trade zone in Punjab, that's a good way to sort of, I feel, it goes perhaps a little along with Friedman's golden arches of foreign policy theory, that when countries are economically integrated, there's less of an incentive for them to go to war. And so if the United States were to push any particular type of foreign policy in South Asia, I think promoting some type of economic relationships and also cultural relationships between India and Pakistan, cultural diplomacy, would go a long way perhaps towards addressing some of the tensions that exist right now.
Thank you. All right, so I'm going to change gears. You've seen the handful of they're quickly multiplying in my hands, so I will try to move through them with your cooperation. The first issue is where Islam plays in. There has been some attention to the fact that Indian Muslim leaders have denied the right of burial for the terrorists in Muslim cemeteries in India as a public statement, and that being their decision. Now, one of the questions I have from the audience is that, as along this lines, Indian Muslims have disowned the terrorists by denying them burial. The Pakistani government has not recognized the terrorists belonging to their country. Conspiracy theories revolving around this could go on. Now, where do we as Muslims view the role of Islam in all of this? Is it an issue? Is it not an issue? That's what this person is leaning into.
Well, it's an issue insofar as Islam is a form of identity, of course. Whether it's an issue with regard to faith or religious observation. I mean, those are things that I think are difficult to speak of because it's hard to talk about somebody else's soul. But we have to recognize that in the United States, we tend to talk of religion as though it is a professional, confessional experience. And there's pretty much only one place in the world in which that's true, America. And even here, it's not all that true. A country in which 78% of the population calls itself Christian, is a country in which Christianity is a national identity, not a confessional identity. This is true across the world. So when militants refer to themselves as either Hindu militants or, for instance, the Christian insurgents in East Timor, or the Jewish underground in Israel, the Kach and Kahane movements in Israel, or the various Muslim militant organizations in South Asia and the Middle East, we hear the word Islam, we hear the word Muslim, and we immediately put that into a category of faith. We need to stop thinking that way. We need to start recognizing that in every part of this world, religion is a form of identity that goes beyond any kind of spiritual or faith associations. When we get into this idea of, well, these men weren't really Muslim because they violated my interpretation of Islam, we're on really sticky ground there. I mean, we have to be really careful about that kind of talk. It makes us feel good. It allows us to sort of place a distance between the values and morals and ideals that Islam strives for and some of these horrific acts that are done in the name of Islam. But the truth is that religion is a form of not just identity, it's a form of self-identity. And so if a group of militants act in some violent manner, and they do so in the name of Islam, then let's not ignore that, okay? Let's not just simply say, yeah, but their Islam is bunk, and so therefore, Islam has nothing to do with it. It's certainly not the case. If they say that they are motivated by their identity as Muslims, we must take that seriously and talk about it and delve into it and find out what it actually means. And the biggest reason, again, why we should do that is that in all parts of the world, not just in the Middle East, but in all parts of the world, religion has, and certainly religious language, has a means of communicating very complex, very gray issues to the public in incredibly simple, bipolar, black and white ways. I think the best example of this, of course, is the war on terror itself, right? The United States isn't engaged in a complex international criminal investigation of a terrorist conspiracy. We're engaged in a war between good and evil. That's easy. That's simple. We can all decide, whether we're on the side of good or on the side of evil. But it's at the same time, we can't just simply sort of dismiss the notion that religion has nothing to do with these ideas. As long as you keep that sense that religion is a form of identity more than it is a form of worship, then we can talk about Islam and what Islam has to say or do with these kinds of attacks.
I'm a little bit, is this on? Okay. I'm a little bit disturbed by the notion that you put forward that you should, instead of rejecting the claims by these terrorists that they are Muslim, that you should examine that. Because I think that as Muslims who don't support terrorism or the taking of innocent lives in the name of Allah, I think that a lot of us are uncomfortable with the notion that these people are doing it, and in doing so are bringing more disgrace to the religion than anyone ever has before. So we're reluctant to give any credibility to them as Muslims. So if we were to, as opposed to outright rejecting that and accepting that that is their identity and examining it, wouldn't we be giving them more credibility than they deserve?
No, quite the contrary. I think that what we would be doing is examining the issue in a much more sober-minded way. Again, we have to separate our desire to turn this into to keep this from becoming a PR fiasco for the Muslim world, and our need, the very urgent need, to recognize the incredibly complex issues, socioeconomic and identity issues that are involved in these kinds of attacks. And simply by dismissing religion altogether because their sense of religion is in such direct violation to what our sense of the same religion is, I think is destructive. I think it's dangerous, and I think it leads to even greater acts of terrorism. Now, let's keep in mind, terrorism is not an ideology. Terrorism is a strategy. It's a tactic. And so, you know, it's a means of creating a sense of power, a sense of attention. And ultimately, it's a way of getting one's grievances out into the public in a way that would otherwise be impossible. So, you know, in a spiritual sense, one's actions are very much, you know, should be reflective of one's beliefs and one's values. But there is something, I think, quite dangerous about simply, in the name of, again, of a PR issue, simply ignoring Islam altogether and saying, well, there's no reason to talk about, you know, the issues of religion and identity in this case because they're not really Muslims.
You know, I'd like to make 2 points on this. The first is that religion as a source of guidance, spiritual guidance or moral guidance of what's right and what's wrong, a complex discussion of theology, morality, all that. That is how many of us may view our own faith. But as Reza was saying, in much of the world, religion is just who you are. And when you see yourself as part of a tribe that is defined by your religious identity, then assaults on your tribe should be repelled, and you have the right and the duty to fight back against those who are oppressing your tribe. And so in that sense, this violence is emanating out of a sense of oppression against Muslims in general or Muslims in particular in some group, but it's not emanating out of a understanding of the Quran or an understanding of some specific Muslim theological point. It's emanating out of a tribal sense of defending your tribe, who you are defining along religious grounds rather than ethnic grounds, for example, or linguistic grounds. Similar to the conflict in Northern Ireland between the Protestants and the Catholics there, it's not a Protestant-Catholic conflict the way the 30 Years' War 4 centuries ago was a Protestant-Catholic conflict. This is just a conflict between two social groups who define themselves along their religion. The other thing I think that we as Muslims should keep in mind is that the role of religiously sanctioned violence in Islam has undergone a tremendous change in the last 30 years. 30 years ago, 40 years ago, when Muslim countries were involved in warfare, they did not use the rhetoric of jihad to the extent that Muslim countries use that today. 30 years ago or 40 years ago, the Palestinian movement was a nationalist movement. It did not use the rhetoric, the Islamic rhetoric, to the extent that it uses it today. They did at that time, but not to the way they do now. The first suicide bombings occurred in the early 1980s. Before that, Muslims did not engage in suicide bombing. And it was only after Muslims started using it, and the tactics seemed to be very successful, that religious justification for it was created. And religious authorities said, yes, you can do suicide bombing in these narrow circumstances. But then, once you let the cat out of the bag, it was open season, and now the biggest victim of suicide bombing is other Muslims, clearly. So I think that there has been a religious component justifying some of the violence that has occurred, that is basically sourced in political conflicts of the last 20 years. And there is some intersection there between religion and violence and politics and terrorism. It's not simply saying that Islam has nothing to do with this. I think that there is some interconnections there that Muslims need to deal with. And I think that's what Reza was saying, that you have to examine why these people are saying that they are Muslims and they are doing these things.
I think that gets to the core of the issue in the sense that we Muslims have to look deeply into this so that we are not being dismissive of the idea that this was perpetrated by Muslims. Well, Muslims don't behave this way, therefore these people aren't Muslim, and ending the argument there. That we owe it to ourselves and to the broader communities in which we live to think more deeply about these issues because of the implications that it draws back into the PR side, but also into the heart of our faith. Because what I think is among the most demoralized element within our community are those young Muslims who are themselves looking at violence perpetrated by people of so-called faith in the world, and looking at the connection back to themselves. And so I want to use that as a segue into the next there's a couple of questions that are coming from the audience that go back to that idea of what responsibility Muslims have here within this context. One person asks, what steps should we take as Muslims to prevent breeding extremists and violence against Muslims, which ends up, as you said, costing more Muslim lives than anyone else? And another person who asks, many Americans are confused about the immense difference between terrorist actions or terrorist attackers and the moderate Muslims worldwide in the United States, and why is it that we still don't see something like a million moderate Muslim march, that's a mouthful, to publicize this difference and to hear the voice of moderate Muslims? And unfortunately, it puts a smile on my face because I know that we all, in as many forums as we go into, you don't walk out of a single one without being asked two questions. Why haven't Muslims condemned terrorism? And where are the moderate Muslims? And maybe this is just my own experience, but I don't walk out of a single room in the United States without those two questions still being asked today, all these years after 9/11. So what is it that we should be doing?
Well, certainly not allowing 1 million Muslims to march anywhere. It's a terrible idea.
Security threat.
Yeah.
Imagine the police force.
This is true. Look, I'll just very quickly answer this issue that Edina brought up at the very end here, this idea, that of course every one of us gets this question all the time. It's a strange question, and it's a question that is not asked in order to receive an answer. If you don't hear the deafening sound of criticism coming from every corner of the Muslim world, then you're not listening. It's as simple as that. So that question, I've never had anyone ask me that question, and I have it asked once a day. I've never had anyone ask me that question who's even remotely concerned or interested in the answer. The question itself, in a sense, is rhetorical. And on the other hand, there is, I think, this uncomfortable weight of responsibility that has fallen on the shoulders of the American Muslim community as the single most diverse, most eclectic gathering of Muslims anywhere on earth. The only place on earth that has a more diverse body of Muslims than the United States, than even Los Angeles, is Mecca during the Hajj, and that's it. And so in a sense, this entire country is a Mecca. And it puts, I think, a sense of responsibility on the American Muslim community to become spokesman for the world's 1.5 billion Muslims. So whatever happens in any corner of the Muslim world, it's your fault, and you better have an answer for it. At the same time, I'm kind of wary of these issues because at a certain point, we got to stop thinking about how do we respond to Muslim issues as Muslims and start recognizing that we need to respond to issues just as human beings, as Americans. I mean, I'm often very frustrated at the almost myopic focus on Muslim issues within Muslim organizations. There are people who are suffering and dying outside of Palestine. There are other issues that besides Kashmir or besides Chechnya that would require attention. Just because they're not Muslim issues doesn't mean that our focus shouldn't be on them. So it's a balancing act. That's all I'm saying. Is yes, we do have a responsibility, and it is important to take advantage of the pluralistic society that we live in. But at the same time, let's get over that a little bit. Let's expand our attention to non-Muslim issues. That's the way that you become a part of America. The way that you become a part of this country is by getting out of your bubble, finally. And I think, it's time for us to do that.
Edina, I think one of the questions there was how do we avoid getting into extremism and along those lines. I think what I would say is that as we teach our younger generation about Islam, make sure that we teach them what is really at the core of the Islamic values. In the Quran, there are a lot of values, there are a lot of things that are in the Quran that are taught and what you should do and what you should not do. But there is one value in the Quran that is above everything else, and that is to do justice. And it says specifically in the Quran to do justice even if it is against yourselves. And if you teach people that, if you teach your children that, that means that when you are faced with injustice or when you are faced with persecution, you do not react with injustice. And that ultimately, if you keep your focus on those basic principles, I think that there is no way you would fall into extremism. So I would say go back to the Quran itself, and the answer is right there.
All right, I'm going to change directions again. The stack keeps getting fatter. So this question is directed to you, Varun. It's a little long, so I'm going to try to skip over little parts of it, but it says, let me play the devil's advocate here. Some historians say that Muslim history in India is extremely bloody, with 80 million Hindus killed in 800 years of Muslim invasion. And also the persecution of Hindus in Bangladesh has resulted in hundreds of thousands of deaths. So as a Hindu, do you think that many Hindus would most likely hold intense hatred for Muslims, almost as much as Native Americans would hold hatred for European Christians for the genocide of the North and South American continents? Do you think that this history of conflict continues to fuel a sense of mistrust?
Well, I think all history is a history of conflict. So it's not unique to South Asia, and it's not unique to Hindus and Muslims. I mean, we have a long-going civil war in Sri Lanka where Buddhists and Hindus are slaughtering each other, and who would have thought, So I think within South Asia, there's a lot more going on than just to say that there's this monolithic group of Muslims and a monolithic group of Hindus, and they're unable to get along. That being said, I am concerned with the amount of sort of anti-Pakistani, anti-Muslim backlash within the Indian community in the United States. I've heard, particularly from, I think, older generation of immigrants who have come here, not so much perhaps from their children. And I saw it in my own family. When I come from a pretty liberal family, and my cousin went to USC. He fell in love with a woman. They wanted to get married, so it was a Trojan story, but it's also my family story. And he was American Hindu, she was American Muslim, and both his family and her family absolutely freaked out and threatened to disown them. And it took, luckily I had a background in mediation because it took 6 months of mediation before we brought them together. But now it's a beautiful family. They just had their first child. They embrace each other every time they see each other. Our Hindu family celebrates Ramadan. They've come over and celebrate Diwali. It's a beautiful thing. So I think that there are small examples. I think we change perceptions sort of on a small scale. It's not going to be a world historical narrative, but there are individual moments of reconciliation that are happening all the time. I think especially within the Muslim community in the United States, the Muslims and Sikhs and South Asians and Arab and Middle Eastern students who are raised and grow up in this post-9/11 era, they have a unique set of challenges that face them. And one of the things that we did at USC, which was incredibly gratifying with the help of our friends at the Civil Rights Office in the Department of Homeland Security, is we brought together some of our Muslim, Sikh, South Asian, Arab, Middle Eastern students from Los Angeles to sit down with members of the Department of Homeland Security, including Secretary Michael Chertoff, and talk to them about what it's like growing up. What are the emotional aspects? What are the political aspects? And what are the legal aspects? And what I saw from 2001 to about 2007 was a lot of critique. And even I was teaching courses in national security law where the critique was about post 9/11 jurisprudence and civil rights violations and the suspension of habeas corpus. But I think we're getting to a point where we're getting beyond the critique, and now we're talking about engagement. And to see Muslim students sit down with the author of the Patriot Act and talk to him directly about what's wrong with the Patriot Act. Well, first of all, I don't know if that would happen in any other country. And secondly, the fact that he was taking notes, he agreed with a lot of what they had to say, and he was passing on those notes to his successor, I think was a profoundly moving moment. So I think that we can combat issues of prejudice and engage in these types of reconciliation encounters, but they happen sort of one encounter at a time. And by doing that, we can create, I think, a larger movement. But I am really impressed with our college students, with the millennial generation. I mean, their first election, they've already changed the world. They're an inspired group that are looking to engage. They're focused on breadth, so they're learning more about traditions than I think the previous generations did. They're technologically savvy, and they're filled with hope. And quite frankly, I feel like whatever prejudices their parents may have brought with them to the United States, this generation will not only leave those prejudices behind, but what I've seen is work with their parents and their uncles and their aunts and their elders to help them get over those prejudices too. So I really think that, I hate to paraphrase Whitney Houston, but I believe that, the youth is that future that's going to be that body that sort of brings us together in that type of engagement.
I should make you sing it because
No, you shouldn't.
Yeah.
That'll end.
That was off mic. That's good. I think that that's an important note for us to strike, and I had a very unique opportunity at USC to be there to talk about this millennial generation, and yeah, while the Whitney Houston reference, gets under my skin. At the same time, I think that there's a lot to be said there because of social networks online, because of the rate of information being passed these days, and because the forums exist for people to engage directly in finding out more information, digging deeper, and talking to people of different backgrounds. And universities present a very unique role and have a very unique responsibility, I think, at the same time today. I have another question from the audience for you, Kiran, that focuses specifically in terms of media responsibility, and particularly looking at how media professionals select so-called Muslim experts to comment on issues. And I want to open this up also, but I want to share this with you, which is this person says, I often notice that when the media brings on experts or representatives of the Muslim community, they're often not reflective of the Muslim mainstream community. What do you think of that?
I'm so glad somebody asked that question, because if there was one piece of advice that I would want to give to those who are responsible for PR, represent the Muslim community in the media, is get your act together, because you are not on our radar. When we are in a pinch and we need an expert, you go to your Rolodex and you pull the last person that was on, the first person who's available. Sometimes I'll get a news story at 8 p.m. on the East Coast, and I'm instantly looking for a psychiatrist on the West Coast because of the time difference to talk about cyberbullying. And I'm going to go to Google, and I'm going to go to the people that we've used before. And what frustrates, I think, Muslims within the media who see this happen over and over again is we don't have, other than Reza, God bless you for not having an accent and speaking articulately, you don't have that in the media. You have the person with the beard who constantly reinforces the negative stereotypes that people have. No offense to anyone who has a beard here, by the way, but I'm just saying that there's a certain stereotype that people have in their mind of a Muslim man or woman, and you see that reflected in their accent, in their discourse, the way that they present themselves. They're not media savvy, they're angry. Nothing wrong with being passionate. I think that you've been able to do that, convey that on the air without coming across as off-putting. And I think that we need to find people who can speak out and much like, two of my colleagues here, and who do it in a non-threatening manner. And it's a matter of investing in that spokesperson and getting them with someone like me or another professional within the media industry and spending an hour media training them.
Yeah, go ahead, Mayor.
Edina, I just wanted to add to the previous question with regards to the history of Muslim conquest in South Asia and such. I think that when you look at history, history is a very bloody thing, and there's a lot of bad episodes that one can dredge up and use to motivate people in the here and now, to make people angry or upset today about something that happened in the distant past, not in your lifetime or your family's lifetime or your parents, but in the very distant past. And the history of South Asia has good aspects and bad aspects to it. Akbar's rule is known for particularly being a very tolerant time. And so there is not just one episode of Muslim South Asian history. There are many episodes, some good and some not good. And the same one can say for any other major civilization. But we cannot allow stories from the past to be used to divide us in the present. And that, I think, is the mistake that people use. And I think a good example of this is Milosevic in Serbia. He was motivating the Serbs based on events that had happened literally 700 years ago. And so one can do this also with the Muslim community, too. And this is an act of demagoguery. It is a dangerous act, and it is something that we should always avoid.
I want to piggyback on the point that you made, Kiran, in terms of, this question of, being the communications person, and I have a background in journalism and am now working on the other side in terms of being in, media relations. And what you have said is what I hear from producers all the time is, first I hear, where have you been? And what do you look like? You don't have an accent, which I think is always interesting. And I know that for myself, I often feel this tension, which is that, to put it very bluntly, in my case, because I know that I get calls that other people don't in terms of doing media appearances because I look different than people expect. And there's the defying stereotypes kind of thing, in the same way that Reza defies stereotypes, not the beard, not the accent, this kind of thing. I know that for myself and being in that position, that there's a tension there between, yes, I represent this community. Ultimately, I represent myself, and I represent what I believe in, my own thoughts. But I wonder sometimes how much space there is within the media spectrum to be able to allow for that diversity of voices that exists, among Muslims. And I agree with you completely about the fact that all too often when Muslims get these all too infrequent opportunities to speak for themselves, that they are botched, that they are missed opportunities because there is so much pent-up commentary that's been building for years and all of this post 9/11 stuff, and then suddenly all of this, what is passion comes off as rage. And there is way too much of this sense of, particularly when you have, I always tell when we do media training, which we take very seriously, particularly, for Muslim audiences around the country, because Muslim organizations on the national level can't do it all. We reach out to national media outlets and work with local ones and try to do the education behind the scenes. And, I know for myself, it's 50-50. Half the time, they're calling to speak to us, and half the time they're calling to ask who they should speak to. And I think that this question of Rolodexes, I know that another colleague that I have who works at NBC News always says, where is the Muslim dermatologist that I can get on the Today Show to talk about complexion? Or to talk about dermatological issues, or the Muslim economist who I can get to talk about other issues, so that we are not only on TV when it comes to crises. And I hate being personal, but I know when people tell me, I've seen you on TV, and I say, I'm sorry, because that means bad news happened. All too often, the only times that Muslims get invited on is to respond to bad news. How much room do you think there is in the spectrum these days, or how much are producers able to take into account slice of life stories when it comes to the Muslim experience? Because so much is reacting to negative news. I'd like to, we have just a few minutes left, and I'd like to just end the conversation on, our original topic, which was taking back or influencing public opinion and public perception, and what the channel is through the media, both news media and entertainment media, for pushing a different kind of image or pushing a real three-dimensional image. So I want to direct us in that place quickly.
Well, quickly, I just want to say, first of all, when it comes to the media and getting your message across, persistence pays off. We are naggers, and we are not averse to nagging. So, you know, poke, poke, poke until, you know, something sticks. It's a slow news day, and the story resonates with us for whatever reason. But also, just to comment on a point that you made about the Muslim dermatologist, a friend of mine is a columnist for the St. Louis Dispatch, Aisha Sultan, and she writes about family matters. And I asked her one time, you know, if she wanted to write about how she personally felt about Obama winning, and she said that she was reluctant to write about a Muslim issue because her objective was to show American society that we're just like everyone else. And so she wanted to be a Muslim who was like a regular person. And by honing in on a message that was specifically Muslim or identified her as Muslim, not that she was shying away from her identity, because it comes across in her column, she mentions that she's very open about her religion, but it was something that she didn't want to do because she wanted to be a voice out there that would resonate with all Americans and break down stereotypes. So that's a great strategy. Yeah, definitely kudos to her. But again, we're always looking for stories. It's just that sometimes the media has the attention span of a gnat, so you're easily distracted, something big happens. I mean, I used to be on air and I'd be working on a story all day, and at the 11th hour, I'd be pulled away from a story that we devoted hours and days of resources to cover a house fire on one end of the city because we had good flames. I mean, so you just have to be persistent and just keep knocking, and eventually that relationship will pay off.
Reza, I want to ask you specifically to talk about BoomGen Studios and this idea of Muslims taking a role in terms of sort of influencing not just news media portrayals, but Hollywood portrayals. Again, we have a few minutes left, but I think that a lot of the questions in this stack get to that idea of Muslims and self-definition that is outside of the realm of terrorism. And so what steps are being taken, and where do we go? What needs to happen?
Well, just very quickly, BoomGen Studios is a film production company that serves as a hub for creative content that's from or about the Middle East, but particularly this generation, and by Middle East, I mean the greater Middle East, which also we include South Asia, North Africa. The point of this is that we recognize that, you know, books don't change minds, and really the media doesn't really change minds either. TV changes minds, films change minds. You know, the best example I can think of is that, as hard as it is to believe, hardly anyone in the United States knew who Mahatma Gandhi was until there was an Oscar-winning movie about Gandhi. Now, everybody, every child in America knows who Gandhi is because of a film. So what we're trying to do is recognize that, you know, if we're serious about reframing perceptions of Islam, and particularly of Muslims in the West, the way to do that is not necessarily through conventions or through books or through news media. The way to do that is through TV shows and films. And so what we're doing is we're providing services for Hollywood. They're very interested in these kinds of stories. They just don't know how to tell them. And so we help them to do so. We help them, once they have told these stories, to be successful in the way that they market these stories. And then we also try to develop some of these stories ourselves. And I think that's really the key here. And it goes back to what I was saying earlier about expanding our horizons, and what was just said a few moments ago about the importance of you don't have to be an expert on Islam and the Middle East in order to have a role to play in the public realm. The issue here isn't so much representing Islam, it's representing America. I mean, you know, being a part of the mosaic of this country. And the best way, I think, for us to do that is to make sure that our talents, our skills are being applied in a way that is beneficial, not just to our own communities, not just to our nation, but to the world itself. And that's how you make a difference. The way that I think you change people's minds is not by making them think differently of you or making them think differently of Islam. It's to make people think differently of Muslims. That's the real key. And the only way that people will think differently of Muslims is if they know Muslims. You know, they're not going to think differently because they read about a Muslim. It's personal experience, personal interaction that matters. And in that sense, we all have a role to play.
Absolutely. And I think that dovetails with, and we're, you know, working in collaboration in some ways. At MPAC, we also have a Hollywood bureau that complements the work of other initiatives that are out there. And the mission is to, there's our senior advisor. The mission is to help them get it right, is to serve as, instead of, I think that one of the shifts in terms of both news media and entertainment media that is so critical is to move away from the position of self-interest and moving into the position of principle. That if we can help get better stories told, period, that serves the common good. And that if we can serve as a resource and as an ally rather than as a watchdog, then we are making huge strides forward. And I think that a demonstration of that, that, you know, is very promising for the future is that today, clear, I mean, pre 9/11, the joke has always been, well, you know, is your daughter or son going to be a doctor or an engineer? I think that today it's safe to say that media and law are the new medicine and engineering for Muslim American young people. And that is a huge step in the right direction, particularly as we seek to have, you know, the only way that we can change and improve what is taking place around us is by being a part of it and by being a part of the solution. And that gets to the core of why we're here and why an organization like MPAC exists, is back to the idea of making Muslims part of the solution. And so I thank all of you for your participation in this extremely engaging conversation. I know I have enjoyed it, and I hope you have as well. And so please join me in thanking our panelists.